Greetings, students, and welcome to Chapter 7. And here we have the second intermediate period, and you'll also see it says the Middle Kingdom too. And some historians kind of overlap the 13th dynasty in with the Middle Kingdom. Certainly by the 14th kingdom, there's been a lot of change, and we'll talk about that. During the second intermediate period, Egypt is overrun by foreign rulers, in this case the Hyksos. So let's begin. And what you're looking at here is the face of Senwosret III, and his reign saw an extension of Egypt's borders through a series of military campaigns and the culmination of changes by which the administration of the country was restructured through greater centralization. And this new policy of centralization led to an end to the building of new decorated tombs in the necropolis, where the great provincial officials and their dependents had been formerly buried. The undisputed centers of the country were the residence at Ij-Tawi, the city built by Amenemhat I near Licht, and Thebes, the center of Upper Egyptian administration, and the dynastic home of the 12th dynasty. In the eastern delta, there was probably a growing center around the site that later became the Hyksos capital, Avaris. Abydos remained a major religious center as the foremost cult place of Osiris. And the last kings of the dynasty, Amenemhat III, Amenemhat IV, and Sobek-Neferu, built on Senwosret III's achievements. Egypt enjoyed a period of great prosperity, seen in the increasing quality of the materials being used for royal and private monuments. And by the late 12th and 13th dynasties, the wealth was spreading down the social scale as more people of the lower elite were able to commission small-scale monuments, such as steles and statues. And many of these objects are of poor artistic quality, probably because the kings were the ones hiring the best artists. There were increased demand, lesser supply of artists, and so, as it says in the slide, only the king and the upper elite would have had access to the best artists. And we have a map here of Egypt in the second intermediate period, and the boundaries, well, you see it kind of goes the 14th, the 15th, and the 16th, the areas that were controlled and considered to be the capitals. So the 12th dynasty was followed by a series of over 70 kings in about 150 years who are grouped together as the 13th dynasty. And despite the rapid turnover of rulers, the government administration continued as before, with no apparent loss of stability. And there was no sudden break between the art and culture of the two dynasties, but as time passed, the area that was controlled by the 13th dynasty was gradually decreasing as the rule was challenged in the delta by foreigners who had settled there. And during the 12th dynasty, immigrants from Syria-Palestine had gradually moved into the eastern delta, bringing with them a distinctive Canaanite culture that allows them to be recognized archaeologically. And eventually a group among them gained political control of the whole delta as far south as the region of Ij-Tawi. The king was forced to abandon the north and to move his residence to Thebes. And the foreigners ruling from Avaris produced a line of rulers of their own who took the titles of Egyptian kings, and they came to be identified as the 15th dynasty. They ruled their territory through local leaders who were later grouped together as the 16th dynasty, and the intrusive foreigners came to be labeled as the aforementioned Hyksos, and that is a word that comes from an Egyptian phrase, Hekakasut, or rulers of foreign lands. And as the territory of the 13th dynasty contracted, the king controlled decreasing resources, and this may have affected the quality of artwork produced by the royal workshops, adding to the decrease in artistic standards already seen in private monuments. And one of the last kings of the dynasty, Wepwawatemsaf, is known only from this stela that you see here that he dedicated at Abydos. And you can see that it's small, and you can see the figures on it, the figure of the king himself facing the figure of Anubis, very crude workmanship, and so that suggests that the king was not able to get artists who were as good, or that he didn't have that many resources. So eventually the Hyksos will be driven out, which we'll see with the 18th dynasty, with the king Ahmose, who you see here. He's actually being represented driving out the Hyksos. So that'll be in the the 8th chapter. So this is a stabilizing political situation where the Hyksos are ruling the north, and a line of local rulers constituting the 17th dynasty rule from the south at Thebes. And there's some evidence that the two sides actually reached an accommodation and weren't actually involved in hostilities. And certainly the 17th dynasty rulers were able to erect monuments at Thebes and other southern cities. However, the last king of the dynasty, Kamose, had ambitions to reconquer the north and refused to accept the status quo. And he died, unfortunately, before he could finish what he started, but his successor, Ahmose, was able to successfully drive them out. And with Ahmose, we have the beginning of the 18th dynasty, which, as I said, we'll get to in the next chapter, but that just gives you a little of the history. So talking a little bit about the king and the art around the king, Senwosret III and Amenemhat built widely all around the country in addition to their funerary complexes at Dashut and Hawara. And large numbers of statues or statue fragments are known for these kings, and many of them are life-size or colossal, meaning huge. And they used all kinds of hard stones. They used granite, quartzite, basalt, and diorite, as well as limestone. And most of them would have been made to stand in temples where they were meant to not only present the king to the gods, but also be ritual focal points and embodiments and reminders of the king's power, strengthening the ties between the king and the local communities where the temples were located. They could also be used to associate the king with prestigious predecessors, and statues erected by Senwosret III in the funerary complex of Nebhet-Petra linked him with the great Theban king who had reunited Egypt. And these statues are very interesting. We see a change in the way that the faces look. The earlier 12th dynasty rulers were going along with the idealized tradition that they had of showing themselves as young and indeed idealized, young, healthy, vigorous. And here the faces of Senwosret III and Amenemhat III, not only are they faces of individuals and immediately recognizable as such, they also show aging. And Senwosret statues all show a severe-looking face, as it says in the slide, but examples vary in the degree of aging they show. The eyes are deep-set and protruding beneath pronounced brows, and you can even see, he's got kind of a furrowed brow there, and you can also see it a little bit here. And the eyes are deep set and protruding. I said that. Heavy curling lids cover the upper part of the eyeballs with pouches modeled under the eyes. So kind of indicating worry, sleepless nights. The ears are large and low set. They stick out from the head, and lines run down from the wings of the nose to the downturned corners of the protruding mouth. Again, with little worry lines around the mouth. And his nose is broken off here, but below a strong chin juts forward. And although the face of Senwosret appears to age, his body doesn't. His body is still vigorous and muscular and looks like, it's very youthful. And in addition, the iconography and the poses are traditional. So it suggests that rather there being a fundamental change in the meaning of the statues, the facial image is new. And that maybe it's displaying a kind of authority and divine rule of the king. One of the things that we see in the literature of this time is the kings referring to themselves as the shepherd of my people. So some people look at this as the images of the faces that they represent a ruler who is indeed worn down by caring for his people, to it looking like a severe face of a ruthless dictator. But what is important is to note it's a departure from what went before, and there's at least one surviving statue of Senwosret II that portrays the king with non-idealizing features. So quite possibly this was a trend that had already started, and Senwosret III was just building on it. And early portrayals of Amenemhat III were influenced by those of his father, but later there's a distinct image that became fixed for the rest of the king's reign and did not age. As with his father, the ears are low set and protruding, as you can see, very large, and lines run from the wings of the nose to the corners of the mouth, and the lips are pushed forward, the chin is strong, but the eyes are a bit more shallowly set, and the brows are only lightly modeled, and the eyeballs are almost flat, and the lips do not turn down. So these are little distinctions that allow us to tell the two kings apart. And representations of the king were not confined to monumental works. So what you're looking at here is some jewelry, and on the left is a type of jewelry known as a pectoral, which is basically a large pendant that would literally sit on the pectoral, essentially pectoral muscles. And this would have been worn by Mereret, a queen. And these sorts of things would incorporate motifs of the king either smiting or trampling his enemies. So it looks like he's smiting in this one. And several caches of jewelry have been found in connection with otherwise plundered burials of royal women in the pyramid complexes of Amenemhat III and Senwosret III. So this is from the cache of Mereret, or Maret, who lived during the reigns of both Senwosret III and Amenemhat III, and owned two pectorals depicting the king. In this one, as I said, he is smiting foreigners. Also, I'm going to call your attention to these oval shapes here, and these oval shapes were called cartouches by the French, and that name has kind of stuck. And the cartouche represents the Shen ring, which represents eternity, and it would have hieroglyphs in it, often with the king's name. In this case, it would be the king's name, and sometimes it would be a god's name. Sometimes it was a way of just showing that a particular object belonged to a king or belonged to a particular person. So this is another pectoral, and this name's Senwosret III, and it imitates a shrine. So it's got a cornice up here, which is supported by slender pillars that have lotuses as their capitals, and the composition divides into two balanced parts, almost pretty much symmetrical, around a central axis. And at the top we have a vulture hovering with outspread wings, and the vertical body lies on the scene's dividing axis, while the horizontal spread of the wings spreads over the two halves, binding them together. And then immediately below the vulture we have Senwosret II's cartouche, and then on either side two sphinxes are facing towards the cartouche, which they're supporting with their forepaws. And then underneath on each side, a kneeling enemy is looking back towards the sphinx with a hand raised in supplication. And the sphinx's other paw tramples the leg of its victim. Ow. A second enemy writhes on his back under the hind leg of each sphinx, and the balanced nature of the composition into which the chaotic poses of the foreigners are subsumed signifies the ordered world triumphant over the forces of chaos. So the king is again trampling the forces of chaos and bringing order to Egypt, going from Nun to Ma'at. And the pectoral is worked in cloisonné. This is actually going to just talk a little bit about the precious gems that we often find. In this slide we see an anklet of Mereret, which has amethyst beads, which would have been imported. And again, just showing the wealth of the pharaohs, that they were in fact able to import things. So the pectoral itself is worked in cloisonné, which is a type of enameling, that basically painting on the gold with a kind of ceramic paste that you would put in a kiln, and then it fuses onto it. So the pectoral is worked in cloisonné with a framework of gold and cells inlaid with pieces of carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli. Highly valued and used in jewelry making, these stones had to be obtained from outside Egypt, and expeditions were sent to Sinai for turquoise. In fact, Amenemhat III in particular has a large number of expeditions specifically for turquoise, and to the eastern desert for carnelian, while lapis lazuli arrived in Egypt along international trade routes from the region of present-day Afghanistan. For those of you that are art majors, lapis lazuli became too expensive to, grind down and as a stone and make into paint, and eventually it was replaced by the color ultramarine. So just a little thing there for you art majors. So in any case, the fact that the stones took a lot to procure adds to their status and their prestige. And here's another look at the pectoral along with some other items that they found in her jewelry cache. And whenever Meroët wore the pectoral, she would have displayed a potent image of royal power for everyone to see, and that reinforces the authority of the king and what was seen as the proper cosmic order. In addition, the image would have functioned on a more personal level to protect its wearer from malign forces. And since the Egyptians believed that misfortune and disease were caused by the malevolent dead and hostile spirits, which were clear manifestations of the agents of chaos, these disasters could be warded off by wearing images of the king triumphantly enforcing order over the chaotic elements of the universe, and such pectorals would have been confined to royal wearers. Now here's something interesting that we have coming up during this period. This is actually a wand, a magic wand. It kind of looks like what we would think of as a boomerang today, but that's because it's carved on the shape of the bone, and the shape of the bone upon which it was carved is kind of left intact. And so in addition to the disappearance of the large decorated tombs from provincial cemeteries, there were changes in the kinds of things we would find in the tombs. So wooden tomb models declined drastically in number and variety and were replaced by small faience models of food items, and further, another of items that are known from settlement sites to have been used by the living, magic wands and rods. Models of protective animals and fertility figurines are now also placed with the dead. And the wands and the rods have images of various deities, mythical and real animals, and hieroglyphs that help the sun god fight and overcome his enemies. And their purpose was to summon these protective powers to guard newborn children and infants from the malevolent spirits and the dead that sought to harm them. And death was equated with rebirth into the afterlife. So the newly dead were basically seen like newborn babies. They would be as vulnerable as newborn babies. So methods that were devised to safeguard the newborn in the living world also worked in the underworld for the soul for its dangerous transition into the next world. And single figures of protective animals featured on the wands and the rods, including lions, baboons, crocodiles, are also found in settlements and burials. The images of lions and crocodiles show how the Egyptians hoped to harness the aggressive power of those terrifying animals and use it for their own protection. And in fact, we often see in the Egyptian gods composite animals of things where there might be a hippopotamus combined with a crocodile or something like that, so that both, the animals would be, their powers would be reflected in that. And so in that same way, the Egyptians are hoping to harness it for their own use. And in much the same way, the king, since early times, would have worn the image of the rearing cobra on his head. The deadly powers of the creature were controlled by the king and turned against his enemies. And we also have these little fertility figurines popping up as well. Often nude female figures with their pubic region carefully marked and maybe even so elaborately emphasize that, as in the case of these wooden plank figures here, they don't even have legs, it just ends at the pubic area. And these were generally made either of limestone or faience, or in some cases wood, as you can see. And their hair is often elaborately arranged, and sometimes the hair would be created from a different material. In the case of these wooden figures, they often used clay that was made from the mud that you found in the Nile. And in more highly detailed examples, the figure even wears jewelry or has tattooing or body painting on the thighs. Sometimes they carry a child, and they're generic images that relate to the general notion of fertility, encompassing sexuality, conception, and also the successful bearing and rearing of children that ensured the continuity of the family and society as a whole. Also interesting is that throughout Africa, we see later on, if you take my African art course, that there's sort of, what would we call them? Substitute children are often carried around as statues for women who are trying to conceive and rear children. So we kind of see the beginning of that here in ancient Egypt. But they also, when they're placed in the tombs of the dead, like the magic wands and the magic rods, they're also icons for the dead to protect, again, that newborn soul as it's trying to make its way in the next world. And then in the later 12th dynasty, coffins with interior decorations became rare, while decorations on the outside became much more elaborate. The top of the coffin was now painted with a design taken from the cavetto cornice, which was an architectural element that you would often see on top of chapels, shrines, gateways, and doors. And on the sides, it was now common to depict a false door below the eye panel here, and as time went on, the other spaces between the inscriptions were also painted with elaborate versions of false doors. And sometimes a pile of offerings would be substituted for one of the false doors, and a figure of Isis might appear on the foot of the coffin and Nephthys, her sister, on the head end. And since Isis and Nephthys mourned the dead Osiris before bringing him back to life, the presence of these goddesses identified the deceased with Osiris, thus guaranteeing his resurrection in the next world. Again, the idea that they're hoping that Isis is going to do for them what she did for Osiris and bring them back. And this was an important development because it was only at this period that figures of deities began to be depicted on non-royal tombs. So important development. Not only is everybody getting a special burial according to what they can afford, they also are starting to have things according to what they can afford that the royalty might have had on their coffins. So very interesting. So in the mid-12th dynasty, a new type of coffin was introduced alongside the older rectangular type and made of wood or cartonnage, which is layers of linen and plaster. I think I talked about that earlier. These coffins imitated the form of a body wrapped in white linen with a large beaded collar placed on the chest and a funerary mask on the face. And they were the first coffins to be made in human or anthropoid form, and this is a shape that remains in use from this time onward. And at Thebes during the 17th century, or dynasty, I don't know why I want to say that, at Thebes during the 17th dynasty, the anthropoid coffin developed a new type of decoration in the form of a pair of wings, as you can see here, wrapping the body from the shoulders to the feet. And these coffins are called rishi coffins, from the Arabic word for feather. And the wings may represent the wings of Isis, wrapped protectively around the deceased. And an image of the vulture goddess Nekhbet often spreads its wings across the chest region in a further gesture of protection. And there's Nekhbet right there. And during the 12th and 13th dynasties, the number of private statues and stelae grew, although the size and quality of the workmanship of the great majority declined. It became increasingly common to dedicate such monuments in temples and shrines, a new phenomenon, as well as in tombs and memorial chapels. And they were placed in the outer areas of the temple rather than the more sacred inner parts. However, their function was to associate their owners with the deity so that they would participate in rituals performed in the temple and share in the offerings made to that deity. And this slide kind of sucks, so I'm sorry about that. But it is showing you a stele, and statues representing single figures continue to be common, But in addition, statue groups showing 3, 4, or 5 figures became increasingly popular. And stelae, as before, have great variety in composition, but several changes distinguish them from earlier examples. So now there's a tendency to include more figures that represent family members or other associates of the tomb owner, while texts no longer feature biographies of the deceased, but instead record the basic offering formula and also list the names of people to be commemorated. Hymns to Osiris or Min may be included, and for the first time, images of deities appear on non-royal stelae. Let me see, up here I believe we've got Min, or Ptah. This is either Min or Ptah. And this parallels the appearance of Isis and Nephthys on the coffins at this time. And the majority of stelae come from Abydos and show the Ithyphallic god Min. Yes, this is Min. And here he's being associated with the triumphant Horus, the son of Osiris, who avenged his father, but other deities appear. And I am sorry, as I said, that it's really hard to see on this particular slide. You'll have to take my word for it. So let's look at how the human figure is represented. So very interesting. Some of the proportions change in the later 12th dynasty, and that remains throughout the 13th to the 17th dynasty. And in their most extreme form, the male figures have small heads in proportion to the rest of the body. This slide doesn't show it quite, but we'll see in some others. The narrow shoulders and waists, a high small of the back, slender limbs, and no visible musculature, which you can see here. This guy has no muscles. And although these features don't always occur together, the presence of even some of these suggests that they're very different from the broad-shouldered, long-backed, muscled figures of the early part of the 12th dynasty. And female figures display even narrower shoulders and waists, slenderer limbs, and a higher small of the back in order to maintain the distinction between men and women. And women continue to wear the traditional close-fitting sheath dress, whereas men wear this very long garment that ties around the top of the body so that you don't see as much of the top of the body. Sometimes it goes as high as right under the arms. And so this also gives you a high small of the back. And in 2 dimensions, sometimes this garment, as we see on the right, is transparent and shows a short kilt being worn underneath. In 3 dimensions, it gets stranger. So when worn by statues, the long opaque garment billows out in front, so it looks like the figure has enormous girth, and it increases the bulk of most of the body in comparison to the small area of the upper torso left uncovered. However, in contrast, statues of men also can wear an enveloping robe like this one here that leaves only the hands, ankles, and feet free, contrasting with statues earlier in the dynasty that have worn only a knee-length kilt. And by the 12th and 13th dynasty, private statuary, the modeling face is a combination of images of Senwosret III and Amenemhat III. Here we have eyes that are protruding under heavy lids. Sometimes the lips might turn down like Senwosret's or be straight like Amenemhat's. Oblique lines run down from the wings of the nose. We have a firm chin, and the ears are once again large and low set, and the resulting faces are not meant to be copies of one another, but they all have this underlying resemblance from their common inspiration of Senwosret and Amenemhat. So here we have a decorated gateway from, I'm not going to try to pronounce the long name that your book prefers, I don't know why. We're just going to call him Sobekemsaf II, which is hard enough to say. So this is from the 17th dynasty king Sobekemsaf II. A gateway near in the Temple of Metamud near Thebes, and originally this was erected by Senwosret III, and it shows the king offering and smiting his enemies before the god Montu. And you can see here it's a very crisply cut, highly incised relief with interior details on the figures and the hieroglyphs very meticulously incised into the scene. And within their figures, both outlines, both figures and hieroglyphs are flat and unmodeled, except for highly stylized musculature on the legs, kind of weird in contrast to the upper body there. And the figures have broad shoulders, waists, and limbs, and long torsos in relationship to the rest of the body. And then a statue of the very same king set up in the Temple of Karnak shows even stranger proportions, I think. I'd love to have a waist like that myself. Although the right side of the throne, ankles, feet, and pedestal are restored, it can be calculated that this red granite figure was originally about 1.8 meters high, so a little bit over life size. And his shoulders are rather narrow, and the waist, as I said, it's very high and pinched, and it gives the impression of a small torso in relationship to a long lower part of the body. And it is a very well-made statue. So this does show us that workshops at Thebes still had good artists at this date. And if you look closely at the face, you can see the inset in the eyes, and at one time the eyes would have been inlaid, and then overlays would have been attached to the eyebrows and cosmetic lines, maybe with semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli. And then unusually, the back of the throne is decorated with two figures of the goddess Ipi standing back to back, and she's usually shown as a composite animal, usually shown pregnant, and she's also one of the deities appearing on the magic wands in order to provide protection to newborns and their mothers. And so here, having her on a monumental temple context, she's protecting the king. And there's an inscription between the two figures that reads, "All protection and life are behind him," and that reproduces a standard formula used in royal temple relief from all the periods. So conclusion, this was a short chapter, just kind of a crazy time for the Egyptians, I think. The proliferation of monuments as people lower down the social scale gained the resources to commission statues and stelae led to a tremendous variation in quality. Workshops staffed by artists outside the royal network must have sprung up to supply the increased demand. And during the 13th century, as the king gradually found his territory and resources reduced by the encroachment of the Hyksos, even the quality of the royal workshops was affected. Nevertheless, it is clear that the kings of the 17th dynasty, even though they controlled only Upper Egypt, were able to command the resources and artists to produce high-quality work. Thus, while many monuments of the Second Intermediate Period exhibit poor composition and execution, the period cannot be dismissed as one that produced no works of artistic merit. So that concludes Chapter 7. In Chapter 8, we will be back to a united Egypt and back to and into the New Kingdom. And some people think that this is perhaps the most glorious time of ancient Egypt. Certainly Egypt reached its greatest military might, and it's the greatest extension of its empire at this time. And we also have some of the most interesting personalities. So it's a fun time to look at. So I will talk with you all soon.